lonely rancher for years, until Apache girl said, "Let me feel you tonight." Jake sat on the porch of his small cabin, looking out across the vast expanse of the ranch. The sun had just begun its slow descent behind the mountains, casting long shadows over the land. The sky was painted in shades of gold and purple, but the beauty of the view couldn't ease the weight on his chest. He had been alone for years, longer than he cared to remember. The ranch was his life. It had always been that way. Jake had inherited the land from his father, a gruff, quiet man who had worked it with his own hands until the end of his days. Jake had promised him he would never leave it, no matter how hard it became. And it had been hard, more difficult than he had imagined when he was younger. There were days when the work seemed endless, when the cattle refused to cooperate, and the weather didn't help either. But the hardest part of all was the loneliness. It was the thing that crept into his thoughts when the sun set and the world quieted. His father had never said much about loneliness, but Jake knew it must have been the same for him. Living out here, isolated from the world, it was easy to feel forgotten. Jake had once been married, but that was a long time ago. His wife, Lily, had left him after just a few years. She had grown tired of the endless solitude, of the hard work and the distance from town. She had wanted more, something Jake couldn't give her. He still remembered the look in her eyes when she told him she was leaving, the way her hand had trembled as she picked up her bag. That was the last time he saw her. After that, he buried himself in the work, hoping that if he worked hard enough, the pain of her absence would go away. It didn't. Instead, it became a constant companion, lurking in the background, never truly leaving. The silence of the ranch stretched out like an endless desert. The wind howled through the empty fields, rattling the windows of the cabin. But it couldn't drown out the echo of his own thoughts. Most days Jake was fine. He had his routine, feeding the cattle, fixing fences, repairing broken equipment. But at night, the quiet would return. The loneliness would settle in, thick and heavy, like a fog. He would sit by the fire, staring into the flames, thinking about what could have been. He had once dreamed of a family, children running through the fields, a wife by his side. But those dreams seemed like distant memories now, faded and out of reach. He tried to distract himself with the land. There was always something to fix or build, and it was the one thing that gave him some sense of purpose. He loved the ranch, even if it was sometimes hard to keep up with all the work. It had been his father's before him, and his father's before that. It was a part of who he was, the only thing that had stayed the same. But the ranch couldn't fill the emptiness inside him. No matter how much he poured himself into it, something was always missing. Jake didn't mind the physical labor. In fact, it was a relief to work with his hands. It kept him busy and helped him forget about the world outside, the world that kept moving forward, while he remained stuck in the past. His neighbors were few and far between, and the nearest town was miles away. He rarely went into town, only when absolutely necessary, when supplies were running low or when the cattle needed medical attention. Even then, he kept to himself, avoiding the small talk and chatter. People in town were kind enough, but they had their own lives to live, their own families, their own busy schedules. They didn't understand the kind of life Jake led, and he didn't think they ever would. There was a part of Jake that had resigned himself to this way of life. He had accepted it, for better or worse. He knew he wasn't going to change. He had spent so much of his life looking backward, wondering where he went wrong, that he couldn't see any way forward. He wasn't angry at the world, he just didn't know how to fit in anymore. The world outside the ranch felt like a foreign place, a place where people had lives that seemed so different from his own. It was early one evening, just as the sun was beginning to dip behind the horizon, that Jake noticed something unusual. He had just finished feeding the cattle and was making his way back to the cabin when he heard something, soft at first, like the rustle of leaves in the wind. But then it came again, louder this time, accompanied by the sound of footsteps. Jake's hand instinctively went to the rifle at his side. He wasn't used to strangers on his land, and the thought of someone being out here, uninvited, set him on edge. It could be anyone, someone looking for trouble, or worse. He stood still for a moment, listening carefully. The sounds continued, but they didn't seem threatening. Jake squinted into the twilight, trying to make out the shape of the figure emerging from the shadows. But he didn't recognize the person, and he could tell it was a woman. Her silhouette was slender, her movements graceful as she made her way toward him. At first, Jake thought she might be lost or in need of help, but as she drew closer he noticed something else, the way she carried herself, confident and sure. It wasn't the way someone would walk if they were scared or in distress. No, this woman was different. She moved with purpose, her eyes scanning the land around her as if she belonged here. By the time she reached him, Jake had taken a few steps forward, still unsure of what to do. The woman stopped a few feet away, her dark hair blowing in the wind. Her eyes, bright and unyielding, met his without hesitation.
"I'm sorry to intrude," she said, her voice soft but steady.
I didn't mean to startle you. Jake wasn't sure what to say. He had never been good with strangers, especially ones who appeared out of nowhere like this. But there was something about her presence that put him at ease, a strange familiarity in the way she stood there, like she had been here before. "What are you doing here?"
Jake asked, his voice rough from disuse.
He cleared his throat, trying to sound less suspicious. "This is private land." The woman smiled faintly.
"I'm not here to cause trouble," she said. "I've been walking for a long time."
"I just need a place to rest for the night." Jake studied her for a moment. She didn't look like someone who needed help, but there was something in her eyes that made him pause. For she wasn't asking for anything more than a place to stay for the night, and that was a request he could easily fulfill. Still, there was something unsettling about her sudden appearance, something that made him feel like this moment was more than just a chance encounter. After a long pause, Jake finally nodded.
"All right,"
he said.
"You can stay for the night, but come morning, I'll need you to be on your way."
The woman didn't seem offended by his terms. In fact, she nodded in agreement, her eyes not leaving his. "Thank you," she said simply. Before turning toward the cabin, Jake followed her, his mind racing. Who was she? What did she want? And why did he feel like this meeting wasn't as random as it seemed? As they walked toward the cabin, Jake couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to change. Something was shifting in the air, like the land itself was holding its breath, and for the first time in years, Jake felt the stirrings of curiosity, a flicker of something deep within him that he hadn't felt in a long time. The storm was far from the first Jake had seen on the ranch, but something about this one felt different. It was sudden, powerful. Just as the sun dipped below the horizon, the sky had been clear, and then, within minutes, dark clouds rolled in, thick and heavy, blocking out the stars. The wind began to pick up, howling across the plains, as if urging the earth to brace itself for what was coming. Jake had lived here long enough to know when a storm was on its way, but this one seemed more intense than usual. Jake had already finished his chores for the evening, and he was just about to head inside the cabin when the wind picked up, snapping the gate of the corral open with a loud bang. He cursed under his breath, rushing to the pen to close the gate before the cattle could get out. As he worked, the wind whipped at his face, sharp and biting, and the first drops of rain began to fall in heavy, cold sheets. Damn it, he muttered, pulling his coat tighter around himself as he tried to wrestle. The gate closed. His hands were shaking, not from the cold, but from the sudden rush of panic. He couldn't afford to let the cattle escape. If the storm hit full force, it could be a disaster. But just as the gate clicked shut, Jake heard a voice, soft but cutting through the roar of the wind.
"Do you need help?" Jake turned around in surprise, barely able to make out the figure standing just behind him, a few feet away.
The rain had come down harder now, and the storm was relentless. Yet there she stood, the woman from earlier, the one he had barely exchanged words with. It was Ayanna. She was drenched, her hair hanging in wet strands around her face, but she didn't seem bothered by it at all. In fact, she looked calm, her gaze steady, unaffected by the chaos of the storm around them. Her dark eyes held a quiet intensity, almost like she was waiting for Jake to make the next move. He had no idea how she had gotten so close without him hearing her, but he wasn't about to ask. He blinked, momentarily speechless.
Don't worry about it," he said, his voice barely audible above the howling wind. "This is my mess to clean up." "Ayanna didn't respond right away."
Breath. Instead, she stepped forward, her boots sinking slightly into the muddy ground. She didn't hesitate as she moved beside him, her movements sure and confident. Jake had been alone for so long, his interactions with others limited to the few necessary trips to town where he didn't stay long enough to get to know anyone. But this woman, Ayanna, was different. She seemed unfazed by the storm, unaffected by the harsh conditions around them. "I've handled worse," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, yet it carried easily through the noise of the storm. Jake watched her for a moment. There was something intriguing about the way she stood there, so calm amid the chaos. The storm felt less threatening with her beside him, though he couldn't quite explain why. She didn't seem to be trying to impress him, or even to help him for that matter. It was almost like she was just here, in this moment, as if this had been the way things were always meant to be.
He nodded, deciding there was no harm in letting her help.
"All right," he said. "If you want to, go ahead." Without another word, Ayanna took a step forward, expertly moving the cattle toward the shelter. Jake hadn't expected her to be so skilled. He had thought she might be a bit lost, out of place. But the way she moved with the animals, calm yet assertive, showed that she knew exactly what she was doing. Her presence on the ranch felt natural, almost as if she had belonged here for far longer than a single day. The storm raged on. But Ayanna didn't seem to mind it. She worked alongside Jake, guiding the cattle into the shelter, ensuring none of them were left outside in the pouring rain. Jake found himself drawn to her quiet strength. He didn't have to say much. She seemed to understand the unspoken language of the land, the rhythm of the ranch, better than anyone he had known. For a moment, the world outside the storm seemed to disappear. There was no loneliness, no silence, only the sound of the rain and the cattle, the steady rhythm of the world moving on despite the chaos. Ayanna worked with him, her movements fluid, her attention unwavering.
It was the first time in a long while that Jake had felt like he wasn't alone.
There was something incredibly comforting in her presence, something that made the storm seem less intimidating, less threatening.
After a while, the rain eased up.
The worst of the storm had passed, and the wind calmed, leaving the night still and quiet once again.
Ayanna stood for a moment, wiping the rain from her face with the back of her hand, her eyes scanning the horizon as though assessing the damage.
Jake, exhausted from the work and the storm, finally allowed himself to relax. "Thanks," he said, breaking the silence. He wasn't sure what else to say, but the words felt right. She had done more than just help with the cattle. In some way, she had helped him too.
I had a look at him and gave him a small smile. "You're welcome."
It's what I do. Jake, wasn't sure if he believed that, but there was something about her that seemed genuine. It wasn't as if she was looking for anything in return or trying to prove something to him. She had simply been there, working alongside him, and that had been enough. Rasp. As they stood in the quiet aftermath of the storm, Jake realized that he didn't feel the usual weight of the night hanging over him. For the first time in a long time, there was someone else here. Someone who understood the quiet of the ranch, the rhythm of the land, the way it felt to work with your hands, to be close to the earth. Someone who didn't need to speak much to make him feel like he wasn't the only one who had ever lived this life. "Where are you from?" Jake asked, his curiosity getting the better of him. The question seemed natural enough, but as soon as he asked, he regretted it. She had just arrived, and he wasn't sure how much of her past she was willing to share. Ayana's gaze softened, but her answer was simple. "I've been around," she said, her voice quiet but strong. "I've seen many places, but none of them felt like home." He hadn't asked her to share anything, but the weight of her words lingered in the air. And for a moment, they stood there in silence, the ranch and the storm still surrounding them.
"I'm not planning on staying long," she added after a beat, her voice steady but with a hint of something else, an unspoken story perhaps.
"Just passing through." He didn't press her further. There was something about her that seemed to want to be left to her own thoughts, to her own journey. Brass. And for some reason, Jake didn't mind that. "You're welcome to stay for a while," he offered, unsure of why he said it. It wasn't like him to invite strangers into his life so easily. But there was something about Ayana that felt different.
At least until the storm's over. Ayana looked at him, her eyes meeting his with that same steady gaze.
For a moment, neither of them spoke. The world outside the ranch was dark and wild, but inside they stood in quiet understanding. Two people bound by nothing more than the storm and the land they stood on. Brasset. "Thank you," she said simply, her voice steady and calm. Jake nodded, not knowing what to say next. It didn't matter. Something had shifted between them. Something unspoken but real. And for the first time in years, Jake wasn't alone. Not completely, at least. Not tonight. The storm had passed by morning, leaving the world fresh and still. The ranch seemed quieter than usual, the air clean and crisp. The morning sun peeked over the mountains, painting the sky in soft oranges and pinks. For the first time in a long while, Jake woke up feeling rested, inspiration. He stepped outside, taking in the beauty of the land around him, his eyes lingering on the rolling hills and the distant line of trees. The ranch was peaceful again, but there was a strange feeling in the air. It wasn't the usual quiet that he had grown used to over the years. This was different. It felt as though something, or someone, had changed it all. Ayana was still there. Jake had expected her to leave at first light, as strangers usually did, but when he had awoken, she was still inside the cabin. He hadn't asked her about her plans, but he had a feeling she wasn't going anywhere just yet. After all, she hadn't given him any reason to believe she would leave so quickly. He had never met anyone like her, and that feeling seemed to linger in the space between them, like a quiet question neither was ready to ask. Ayana had already started her own work by the time Jake stepped outside. She was standing by the fence, her back straight as she repaired a section that had been knocked loose during the storm.
Jake was surprised by how quickly she had gotten to work.
The woman had a quiet determination, an energy that seemed to match the land itself. She didn't need anyone to tell her what needed to be done. She just knew. It was a kind of knowing that Jake could only admire. Jake grabbed his tools and joined her, offering a simple greeting. "Morning." Ayana glanced up at him, offering a small smile.
Morning, she replied, her voice calm and steady. I fixed the fence near the back.
The cattle won't get out now.
Jake looked at the fence she was working on. That's good.
Thank you. He wasn't used to receiving help.
Breath. It felt strange, yet there was a comfort in it, a strange sense of relief. He wasn't alone in the work anymore. The two of them worked together for a while, repairing the other sections of the fence that had been damaged by the storm. The morning passed in silence, but it wasn't uncomfortable. There was something about the way they worked side by side that made the silence feel natural. They didn't need words to communicate. They just moved in sync, each of them understanding what the other needed without having to say anything. By midday, they had finished fixing the fences. Ayana was covered in dirt and sweat, but she didn't seem bothered by it. She was used to hard work. That much was clear. As they sat down to take a break, Jake couldn't help but watch her. There was a quiet strength about her, an ease in her movements, as if she belonged here just as much as the land did. Jake had always thought of the ranch as his own, a piece of land that no one could understand the way he did. But now, with Ayana beside him, he realized something he hadn't before. Maybe he wasn't the only one who understood the land after all. She caught him staring and raised an eyebrow, her lips curling into a small grin. What?
Jake cleared his throat, a little embarrassed. Nothing. I just never expected you to be so good with the work. Ayana laughed softly, the sound warm and unforced. You're not the only one who knows how to work hard. I grew up on the move.
My people, they taught me how to survive, how to work with the land.
Jake didn't know much about her past, but he had a feeling there was more to her story than she had shared.
He didn't press her further. She had given him just enough to understand that she wasn't someone who had come to this place on a whim. Rasp. She had a history, just like him. She had lived, struggled, and fought in ways Jake couldn't even imagine.
You don't have to stay, you know, Jake said, surprising himself with the words.
It wasn't a question. It was more of an offer, a chance for her to leave if she wanted to. If you've got somewhere else to go, I won't keep you. Ayana met his gaze, her eyes steady and unreadable. I'm not going anywhere, she said simply. Not yet. Jake nodded, not sure what else to say. Wasn't used to people staying with him. He wasn't sure he even knew how to have someone around for an extended time. His life had been built on the idea of solitude. He had convinced himself that he didn't need anyone else, that it was better this way. But something about Ayana's presence made him question that belief. She didn't feel like a stranger. It was as if she had always been a part of the land, like she was meant to be here. Maybe it was the quiet way she worked, or maybe it was the way she seemed to understand him without needing to be told. Whatever it was, Jake couldn't deny the pull she had on him.
As the day wore on, the two of them fell into a routine.
They worked together, ate together, and in the evening shared the quiet of the cabin. Jake found himself looking forward to these moments. The silence was different now. It wasn't the heavy kind of loneliness that had always pressed on him before. It was a quiet that felt comfortable, shared. There was something familiar about it. Something that made him feel, for the first time in a long time, that he wasn't as alone as he thought.
That evening, after they had finished the day's work, Jake found himself sitting by the fire, his mind racing.
Ayana sat across from him, her eyes reflecting the soft light from the flames. She hadn't said much, but there was something in the air between them that felt different. The connection between them had grown, unspoken yet undeniable.
"Tell me about your people," Jake said suddenly, the question coming out before he could stop it.
He wasn't sure why he asked. Maybe he was curious about her past. Maybe he wanted to understand more of who she was. Ayanna looked up at him, her eyes dark and thoughtful.
"There's not much to tell," she said after a pause. "We lived in harmony with the land, always moving with the seasons."
My people are strong, resilient. We don't settle in one place for too long, but we always find a way to survive. Jake nodded, his mind piecing together fragments of what she had said. He wasn't sure what it all meant, but he knew that she had lived a life far different from his own. Still, in a way they were similar. Both of them had lived in solitude, each tied to the land in their own way, bound by a deep respect for its power and its quiet. Maybe that was why they had found each other here, on this ranch, in this moment. The land had brought them together, as it often did with those who understood it. As the fire crackled, Jake and Ayanna sat in silence, each lost in their thoughts. The connection between them, while unspoken, was undeniable. They were no longer strangers. They were two people who understood each other in a way that words couldn't describe. It was a quiet bond, one forged in the silence of the ranch and the stillness of the storm, but it was real. And in that moment, as they sat by the fire, Jake realized that he wasn't alone anymore. But he didn't know where this connection with Ayanna would take him, or what the future held. But for the first time in a long time, he didn't feel the crushing weight of loneliness. He felt something else, a sense of peace, of companionship, of understanding. It was a quiet thing, but it was enough. The days seemed to pass faster now. Each morning, Jake awoke to the same peaceful routine, but everything felt different. The ranch, which once felt like a solitary fortress, now felt alive. Ayanna had become a part of it, just as much a part of the land as the cattle in the soil. They worked together every day, side by side, in a quiet rhythm that felt natural, as though they had always shared the same space. At first, Jake had felt awkward, unsure of how to act with Ayanna around. But as time passed, he found himself looking forward to the mornings when he would see her, to the evenings when they sat together by the fire. They spoke more now, not just about work, but about the things that mattered. Ayanna had told him more about her past, though she never revealed everything. She spoke of her people, the Apache, and how they had always moved with the seasons, never staying in one place too long. She had wandered far from home, searching for something she couldn't quite explain. But in her eyes, Jake saw the same longing he had felt many times in his own life. A search for peace, for belonging. Jake, in turn, shared bits of his own story, though he never went into too much detail. He told her about his father, the ranch, and how it had always been his responsibility to keep things going. He spoke of the days when his life had seemed full, before everything had changed. He told her about Lily, though he didn't mention the pain. There was no need to speak of the past in that way. It was enough to know that he had lived through it and come out the other side. One evening, after a long day of work, they found themselves sitting by the fire again. The wind had picked up, rustling the trees, but the warmth of the flames kept the chill at bay.
Ayanna was sitting across from Jake, her gaze fixed on the fire, her face illuminated by the flickering light.
Jake had never seen her like this. Quiet, contemplative. It was as if she was lost in her thoughts, but in a way that was familiar, not sad. He wanted to ask her what she was thinking, but he didn't know how to put it into words. Instead, he simply watched her, wondering what had brought her here, to this ranch, at this moment. He had come to care for her in a way he hadn't expected. There was something about her presence that made him feel less alone, less like an outsider in his own life. She didn't judge him for his solitude. She didn't try to change him. She simply existed beside him. And that, in itself, was enough.
Ayanna finally spoke,
breaking the silence. "You've lived here alone for a long time, haven't you?" Her voice was soft, but there was a quiet understanding in her tone, as if she already knew the answer. Jake nodded slowly, his gaze still on the fire. "Yeah," he said. "It's been a long time. I've gotten used to it. Don't need much, really." Ayanna was quiet for a moment. "I can tell," she said softly. "But sometimes, even when you think you don't need anyone, it's nice to have someone there." Jake turned his head slightly, catching her gaze. "I know," he said, his voice low. "I didn't realize how much I missed it until you showed up. I never thought I'd get used to having someone around again." She smiled, a small, knowing smile that tugged at his heart.
I wasn't looking for anything either. I didn't know what I was searching for.
"But I think I've found it."
Jake's heart skipped a beat. He wasn't sure what she meant by that, but the words seemed to hang in the air between them, heavy with meaning.
He couldn't explain the feeling that stirred inside him, the way his chest tightened at the thought of what might be happening between them. He had never allowed himself to think about anything more than the work, the ranch, the endless cycle of survival. But now, with Ayanna here, it felt like something had shifted. It wasn't just the ranch.
It was everything. Ayanna stood up, brushing the dirt from her hands.
But she walked over to the edge of the porch and looked out at the vast land stretching before them. Jake joined her, standing beside her in comfortable silence. Together they watched the stars begin to appear in the sky, one by one, like tiny lights scattered across the dark canvas above them. It was a beautiful sight, and Jake found himself appreciating it more than usual. Maybe it was the company, or maybe it was just the way the world felt different, with someone else beside him.
You ever think about what you want, Jake? Ayanna's voice broke the silence once again, but this time it felt more like a challenge than a question. Jake didn't answer right away.
The question caught him off guard. He had never really allowed himself to think about what he wanted, beyond surviving. His days had been filled with work, with keeping the ranch going, with maintaining a life that was simple but isolated. But now, with Ayanna beside him, he was starting to wonder.
What if he could have something more than just this? What if he could have a life that wasn't so empty? A life where he wasn't constantly yearning for something he couldn't define?
"I don't know," he said finally, his voice quiet. "I've spent so long just getting by. I never stopped to think about what I really want."
Ayanna turned to face him, her eyes serious.
"Maybe it's time to start thinking about it." Jake looked at her, really looked at her, and for the first time in a long time he felt something stirring inside him. Something beyond the quiet longing that had always been there. Something stronger, more hopeful. He had never thought about the future. He had never allowed himself the luxury of imagining anything beyond the day-to-day struggles of life on the ranch. But now, with Ayanna here, he couldn't help but wonder.
What would life look like if it wasn't just about surviving?
What if it could be something more?
"I don't know what the future holds," Jake said, his voice steady but uncertain.
"But I think I'm ready to find out." Ayanna smiled at him, a gentle, encouraging smile that seemed to say she understood.
"That's a good start,"
she said. Sometimes it's just about taking that first step. For the first time in years, Jake felt a shift within himself. He wasn't sure what the future held, but he knew one thing for certain. He wasn't alone anymore, and that was enough to make him believe that anything was possible. As the night stretched on, Jake and Ayanna stood side by side, watching the stars above them.
It wasn't just the beauty of the night sky that held his attention. It was the feeling of something new, something that had begun to grow between them.
They were no longer just two strangers on a ranch. They were two people who had found something real, something worth holding on to. Jake wasn't sure where this would go, or what the future held for them. But for the first time in a long time, he felt a sense of peace. Maybe this was the beginning of something new. Maybe it was the start of a life he had never imagined. But one thing was clear. For the first time, he didn't feel so alone. The days that followed felt like a new chapter in Jake's life. It wasn't as though everything had suddenly changed overnight, but it felt different. Subtle, but real. The work on the ranch continued, but with Ayanna by his side, it didn't feel as hard. In the mornings they worked together, fixing fences, tending to the cattle, and checking the land. At night, they sat by the fire talking or simply enjoying each other's quiet company. Jake found himself looking forward to the evenings more than he had ever done before. Celebration. The silence that had once been oppressive now felt comforting, shared between them in a way he had never imagined possible.
Ayanna never rushed him to speak.
She didn't press him to open up about his past, but there was a quiet understanding between them that made it easier to talk. She seemed to know when he needed space and when he was ready to share something, no matter how small. One evening, after a long day of work, they were sitting on the porch watching the sun dip below the horizon. The sky was a canvas of orange and pink, and the world around them was bathed in the soft light of dusk. Jake had been sitting in silence, lost in thought, when Ayanna spoke up, her voice breaking through the stillness. "Do you ever wonder why you're still here?" she asked, her tone gentle but curious. Jake looked at her, surprised by the question. He had never really thought about it in that way before. "What do you mean?" he asked, trying to understand what she was getting at. "I mean..." Ayanna paused for a moment, as if choosing her words carefully. "Why do you stay here, on this land?" "Why not move on? Go somewhere else? There's a whole world beyond these hills, Jake." Jake leaned back in his chair, considering her words. It was true that he could leave if he wanted to. He wasn't bound to the ranch by any legal contract. The land was his, but that didn't mean he couldn't sell it and find a new life somewhere else. Bias. Still, the thought of leaving had never occurred to him. "I've always been here," Jake said quietly, his voice almost like a confession. "It's all I've ever known. My father, he worked this land." His father before him. "I don't know anything else." Ayanna nodded, understanding. "But that's not the same as choosing it, is it?" she said softly. "Sometimes we stay because we're used to something, not because we truly want it." Jake thought about that for a moment. Was he just staying because it was what he knew? Or was there something more? He looked out at the land, the hills that stretched far into the distance, and, for the first time, he asked himself what it would be like to leave. Or to step away from the only life he had ever known and explore something new. The idea was unsettling, yet strangely exciting. "I don't know what I'd do if I left," he admitted.
I've always thought I was meant to stay here, keep this ranch going, but maybe...
Maybe you're right. Maybe there's something more out there. Ayanna looked at him, her eyes thoughtful. Sometimes the hardest thing is admitting that there's more to life than what we're used to. "But I think you've already begun to change, Jake. You're not the same man who first came to this ranch." "You've started to think about what you really want. That's the first step." Jake was quiet for a moment, absorbing her words. He hadn't realized how much he had changed since Ayanna had come into his life. Before, everything had been about survival, about keeping the ranch going. But now it felt like there was more at play, something deeper, something he had been missing all along. I guess I've never really thought about it like that, he said, his voice filled with wonder. I've just been so focused on the work, I never considered what else could be out there.
Ayana smiled, her eyes softening.
That's the thing about life. It's easy to get caught up in the routine, to just go through the motions. But there's always something more waiting for us, if we're brave enough to reach for it. Jake's gaze met hers, and for a moment there was a silence between them that was different from the usual quiet. This silence felt full, as if both of them were contemplating something important. Jake didn't know where this conversation would lead, but he could feel something stirring inside him. It was the first time in a long while that he felt truly open to the idea of change. For a long while they sat there, side by side, watching the sky darken and the stars appear one by one. The land stretched out before them, vast and endless. It was beautiful, in a way that took Jake's breath away. But more than that, it was full of possibilities. The thought that maybe, just maybe, he could change his life, that he could leave the ranch behind and find something else didn't seem as impossible as it once had. The next few days passed in a blur of work, but the conversation they had shared stayed with Jake. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was shifting inside him. He wasn't sure what he wanted yet, but he knew that for the first time in a long while he was starting to think beyond the land, beyond the ranch. One morning as they worked together to mend a fence, Jake found himself talking to Ayana more than usual. They spoke about what might lie beyond the horizon, about the places they could go, and the things they could do. Ayana, too, had her own dreams. She spoke of the places she had seen, the adventures she had experienced, and the ones she still longed for. Her words filled Jake with a sense of wonder. She wasn't just a woman passing through, but someone who had lived, someone who understood what it meant to explore, to seek, to find something new. And somehow, being with her made Jake want to do the same. By the time evening came, Jake felt a strange sense of peace that he hadn't felt in years. The ranch, the land, it was all still there. But now it didn't feel like the only thing that mattered. He had begun to realize that he wasn't bound to it, that he could leave if he wanted to. But what was more important than that was the fact that he was no longer alone. He had someone to share this moment with, and in that there was a kind of freedom he had never known before. That night, as they sat by the fire, Jake turned to Ayana with a question he hadn't yet dared to ask. "What do you think happens after this?" "After all this work and all this time." Ayana looked at him, her eyes thoughtful. "I think we move forward. We take the next step, whatever that is." Jake nodded slowly, a sense of clarity washing over him. He didn't have all the answers, but he knew that he was ready for whatever came next. The future was still uncertain, but for the first time in a long time, that didn't scare him. There was something exciting about the unknown, about the possibility of a new life, a new chapter. And with Ayana by his side, he knew that he could face whatever came next, no matter how uncertain it might be. As the fire crackled and the night stretched on, Jake realized that this was just the beginning. The ranch, the land, it would always be a part of him, but now he understood that he didn't have to be defined by it. He could create something new. And with Ayana beside him, the future seemed wide open, full of possibility.